You can tell when a man's life has started to turn against him. It doesn't begin with explosions or dramatic breakdowns. It begins quietly, in the private territory of his own mind. A subtle irritation, a sense that the days are repeating themselves, a heaviness that settles behind his eyes when he wakes up in the morning. He looks at the world he built or inherited and realizes it no longer answers to him. It no longer reflects anything he respects. Something deeper inside him begins to resist, like an old engine that refuses to keep running on the wrong fuel. Every man reaches this crossroads eventually, the moment when the version of himself he has been presenting to the world starts to lose structural integrity. He goes to work, he comes home, he performs in the roles expected of him, but something in his posture betrays a truth he hasn't spoken yet. He has outgrown the life he is living, and the strange part is that nobody around him notices. People see his routine, not his rupture. They interpret his silence as stability. They assume he is fine because he is functioning, but inside him, the foundations are shifting. His instincts, the ones he learned to suppress in order to survive, impress, or comply, start to wake up again, not with rage or chaos, but with clarity. This clarity is uncomfortable. It cuts through excuses he has relied on for years. It exposes the small compromises that have accumulated into a life that feels too tight for him to stand up straight in. A man can lie to others with impressive skill, but his own psyche is merciless. It knows when he is living beneath his potential. It knows when he has traded purpose for predictability. It knows when he is performing masculinity instead of embodying it. Most men ignore this internal shift. They drown it with work, numb it with distractions, negotiate with it by promising themselves they'll make changes when things calm down, when money improves, when the timing is right. But the timing never becomes right, and the soul does not negotiate. A man who ignores himself becomes a stranger in his own life. You may not realize it, but what you're feeling now, that quiet agitation, that discontent that refuses to leave, that suspicion that you are meant for something larger than the life you've settled into, is not failure. It is the first signal that your inner architecture is preparing for reconstruction. Something in you is ready to grow, and it will destroy anything that tries to hold it in place. Jung understood this well. He knew that a man does not evolve through comfort. He evolves because some ancient part of him refuses to let him stagnate, not the civilized man, but the sovereign one. The part of you that remembers you were not born to simply maintain a schedule. The part that knows every man has an internal threshold he must cross if he wants his life to belong to him instead of the world. When that threshold appears, it doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It appears through dissatisfaction, through the sudden awareness that the praise you receive doesn't nourish you, that the stability you've built doesn't inspire you, that the roles you play bring no pulse of vitality. This is not depression, this is not emptiness. This is the psyche stripping away everything that has outlived its usefulness. If you feel it, you're not collapsing, you're being summoned toward a life that requires more intelligence, more presence, more self-respect than the one you've been tolerating. Summoned toward a version of manhood that cannot be borrowed from culture or inherited from family expectations, a version that must be forged from your own confrontation with yourself. And this is where the true initiation begins, not when a man succeeds, but when he can no longer stand the weight of a life that does not match the magnitude of his inner world. There comes a moment when a man realizes he can't keep hiding inside his own habits. He notices that the routines he once relied on no longer protect him. They confine him. They give him structure, yes, but they also limit him to a narrow corridor of experience where he cannot expand, cannot test himself, cannot feel alive. He begins to sense that the life he built was constructed more out of obedience than vision. And this recognition is uncomfortable because it disrupts the story he tells himself about who he is. Men like to think of themselves as rational, deliberate, self-directed. Yet most men are shaped far more by expectations than decisions. They follow the blueprint handed to them, believing that adulthood is defined by maintaining stability rather than creating meaning. But a man eventually discovers that stability without meaning becomes a slow erosion of the self. This is the beginning of the masculine rupture, not the dramatic collapse that movies romanticize, but the quiet realization that he has been living on the surface of his own potential. He hasn't failed, he simply hasn't begun, and that realization burns far deeper than failure ever could. Once a man becomes aware of this, he can't return to sleep. He may try. He may attempt to drown the awareness with productivity, entertainment, even relationships that allow him to avoid confronting himself. But the truth keeps resurfacing in subtle ways. In the heaviness he feels while driving home, in the irritation that strikes him when someone tells him he should be grateful, in the boredom that settles in places where excitement used to live. These feelings aren't random, they are directives, signals from the deeper masculine layers within him. The king demanding purpose, the warrior demanding challenge, the magician demanding inner clarity, the lover demanding vitality. When these archetypes awaken, a man can no longer live as he did before. He has to expand or he will decay. The most dangerous thing that can happen to a man is not misfortune, it is comfort without fulfillment. Comfort seduces him into shrinking. It gives him just enough safety to stay predictable, but not enough meaning to feel alive. A man trapped in comfort becomes numb, and numbness erodes masculinity faster than exhaustion or stress ever could. The world misinterprets this internal shift. When a man grows silent, people assume he is simply tired. When he withdraws, they assume he is disinterested. When his patience runs thin, they interpret it as irritability. But those who understand men know exactly what is happening. He is dismantling the life he built without intention. He is searching for the fracture lines that will allow him to rebuild himself from something truer. This process is not dramatic on the outside. It's subtle. It happens in the mind long before it shows in behavior. A man starts to question the commitments he made at a time when he didn't truly know himself. He begins to reevaluate the promises he made out of fear rather than desire. He starts to notice how often he agreed to things simply because he didn't want confrontation. He sees how often he dimmed his own potential so others could remain comfortable. This realization is not an indictment of his character. It is the first breath of the magician, the inner intelligence that sees beyond illusion. Once he sees this, the old version of himself begins to fall apart naturally, not out of weakness, but because the scaffolding cannot support the weight of the man he is becoming. This falling apart is necessary. It is not a collapse, it is a shedding. The persona dies so the sovereign can emerge. A man is not meant to remain who he was at 25. He is meant to evolve into someone with deeper insight, sharper discernment, stronger instincts, and a clearer sense of direction. But none of that growth is possible until he confronts the stagnation he has been numbing for years. This confrontation is uncomfortable, but it is also liberating. When a man finally admits to himself that he has outgrown the life he built, the ground beneath him shifts. Uncertainty appears, but so does possibility. Anxiety arises, but so does instinct. He loses the comfort of familiarity, but gains the first real taste of sovereignty. And this is where the real transformation begins, when a man stops asking how to restore what is breaking and starts asking what needs to be built in its place. A man who begins questioning his own life often discovers that the hardest part isn't the dissatisfaction itself, it's the honesty required to understand where the dissatisfaction comes from. We like to believe we make our choices consciously, but a significant portion of a man's life is shaped by the pressure to be agreeable, reliable, and predictable. These qualities are socially rewarded, yet when taken too far, they turn a man into a version of himself that feels smaller than the one he senses within. Once he recognizes this shrinking, a tension forms between who he has been and who he feels he could become.
It's not an identity crisis in the dramatic sense, but a quiet rift in the psyche. Something inside him is no longer willing to stay domesticated. He may not talk about it, but he feels it every day, in the way he hesitates before making decisions, in the way he postpones ambitions that once excited him, in the way he notices himself seeking permission for things that should be his choices alone. This internal resistance often begins with subtle questions he never dared to ask. How did I end up here? Why does every week feel like a repeated scene? What happened to the instincts I trusted when I was younger?
These questions aren't signs of weakness or confusion. They are evidence that the magician within him is waking up, the part capable of observing life without illusions. This inner observer begins to notice how often he silenced his own judgment to avoid friction, how often he said yes to maintain peace rather than because he truly wanted something, how often he adapted to expectations that were never aligned with his deeper values. This is the psychological equivalent of a tectonic shift. It doesn't make noise, but it rearranges everything beneath the surface. A man in this stage often feels torn between two impulses. One part of him wants to preserve the stability he has built. Another part wants to dismantle it entirely and start again. He stands between these impulses, trying to interpret which voice belongs to fear and which belongs to truth. And this uncertainty can be disorienting because neither option feels entirely comfortable. But discomfort is not an enemy. For men, discomfort is often the first sign that instinct is returning. It sharpens perception. It strips away the stories he repeated to justify staying where he no longer belongs. It forces him to address the gap between the life he tolerates and the life he actually wants. This gap is where the warrior begins to stir, not in the aggressive, performative sense, but in the quiet recognition that courage is needed. Courage to disrupt what is familiar. Courage to pursue something unknown. Courage to stop performing competence and start living with intention. A man doesn't need motivation for this. He needs clarity. And clarity comes when he stops hiding his dissatisfaction beneath layers of rationalization. Once clarity emerges, something unexpected happens. He begins to see his life without the filters he once depended on. He sees which relationships drain him and which strengthen him. He recognizes how certain obligations were accepted without ever being negotiated. He notices the subtle ways he abandoned his own direction for the sake of harmony. This realization is rarely comfortable. It forces a man to confront the compromises he made long before he had the emotional vocabulary to understand them. But as painful as this clarity can be, it is also stabilizing. It grounds him. It gives him a center of gravity he didn't have before. It becomes the first brick in the reconstruction of his sovereignty. A sovereign man is not someone who has everything figured out. He is someone who refuses to keep betraying his deeper instincts just to maintain appearances. He starts choosing his actions deliberately instead of reactively. He becomes aware of the boundaries he never set and begins to reinforce them without apology. He stops outsourcing his direction to people who have no investment in the outcome of his life. This shift is internal long before it becomes visible externally. People around him may sense a change without understanding it. His tone becomes quieter but firmer. His decisions take longer but feel more final. He no longer needs to win arguments or prove anything through performance. A man entering this phase is becoming centered. His authenticity begins to outweigh his compliance. And once this psychological center appears, he realizes something profound. Stagnation was never the problem. Permission was. He was waiting for someone to allow him to evolve, to pursue meaning, to abandon the scripts that were handed to him. But no one can authorize a man to become himself. That authority must be claimed from within. When a man finally stops negotiating with his own dissatisfaction, he meets the emotion he has been avoiding the longest. Fear. Not the obvious kind that announces itself with panic, but the quieter, more strategic version that lives beneath his decisions. This fear doesn't speak in dramatic warnings. It whispers. It questions. It convinces him to postpone what he already knows he must do. It protects him from the discomfort of change by convincing him that the life he has is good enough. Every man believes he is immune to this form of fear until he confronts something he genuinely wants. Ambition exposes timidity. Desire exposes hesitation. Purpose exposes avoidance. When a man recognizes the distance between where he is and where he knows he should be, fear steps in with the subtle promise that later is safer than now, but later is where a man's potential goes to die. The irony is that fear often appears strongest right before a breakthrough. It resists precisely at the point where his life begins to tilt in a new direction, not because the path ahead is wrong, but because the ego fears losing its familiar landscape. The ego would rather remain unhappy in predictability than risk discovering who a man truly is when he steps outside the boundaries he inherited. This is where the warrior becomes indispensable, not as a symbol of aggression, but as the archetype that refuses paralysis. The warrior is the part of a man that can look directly at fear and remain steady. It doesn't eliminate the fear, it renders it irrelevant. It understands that fear is simply a signal that the next chapter demands more from him than the last, and instead of retreating, it moves toward the feeling, not away from it. A man begins to recognize this warrior energy when he stops running from the truth of his own potential. Something shifts in him. His language changes. His posture changes. He becomes less apologetic and more intentional. Not louder, quieter, but in a way that carries weight. He starts making choices based on what strengthens him rather than what soothes him. He begins letting go of obligations that once felt sacred because he finally sees they were shaping him into someone he didn't want to become. This transition confuses those around him. They ask why he has changed, as if change is a violation. They question his decisions, as if his previous compliance was the standard. They attempt to pull him back into the versions of himself that made their lives convenient. But a man who has looked his fear in the eye can't return to being manageable. He becomes grounded in a way that makes manipulation ineffective. He no longer reacts to guilt or pressure. He begins to see through dynamics that once controlled him. And because he now understands how he remained small for so long, he becomes far more difficult to influence. This clarity is not arrogance, it is alignment. It is the magician cooperating with the warrior, forming a new psychological center. Fear doesn't disappear, but it loses its authority. Instead of dictating behavior, it becomes a compass. Wherever the resistance is strongest, that is often where growth is waiting. At this point, a man no longer asks whether he should change. The real question becomes what he must dismantle first. Some dismantling is external: obligations, environments, habits that dilute ambition. But the essential dismantling happens within. He must confront the beliefs he inherited without questioning. He must address the relationships he nurtured out of politeness rather than truth. He must acknowledge that he outgrew identities he still feels obligated to maintain. This is not rebellion, it is reclamation. A man who reaches this stage begins to understand something most people never realize. Fear isn't trying to stop him, it's trying to initiate him. It's a threshold guardian, not an enemy. It demands proof that he is serious before granting passage. It wants to know whether he will choose the familiar or the real, and his answer is revealed not in words, but in movement. A man knows he is crossing that threshold when he stops pretending to be confused. Doubt dissolves not because life becomes clear, but because he becomes unwilling to remain where he has been. If this video transformed your thinking, like, share, subscribe, support the channel link in description.